Hello, welcome. You're watching the France 24 interview. It's American arrogance and bullying. Iran pulled few punches as it reacted to this week's speech by Mike Pompeo, in which the new U.S. Secretary of State threw down the gauntlet against Iran, threatening to impose what he called the strongest sanctions in history on the Islamic Republic, unless it changed course. Now, the Europeans here are so far defiant, they're vowing to salvage a deal that they say was working just fine. And it's a stance that puts them on a potential collision course with Washington. Now, joining me from Washington right now, from the State Department, to help shed some more light on this issue and help us sort of work it through is Brian Hook. Brian is a senior policy advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. You also served, I'll note, under his predecessor, Rex Tillerson. Thanks for joining us. Listen, cutting to the chase here. On this side of the pond, here in Europe, we've had the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, today. She reacted essentially by saying that your boss, Mike Pompeo, did not demonstrate how walking away from the 2015 Iran deal would make the region any safer against nuclear non-proliferation or help put anyone in a better position to influence Iran's behavior. How do you respond to that?
Well, we look at it much differently. The Iran nuclear deal actually allowed Iran to increase its aggression across the Middle East. It certainly increased the revenues that flowed to the regime, and they then used that money to fund foreign wars around the Middle East, to fund proxy campaigns in a range of Middle Eastern countries, and this has destabilized the Middle East. And so I think that you've seen during the last 3 years Iranian expansion across the Middle East, much to the detriment of so many countries. And at the same time, you've had this corresponding restraint on the part of the United States and Europe to address the whole range of malign activities that Iran has been advancing. And so what we're trying to do is to take a comprehensive approach that addresses the totality of Iran's threats, nuclear and non-nuclear.
But Brian, let me just put this to you. The Europeans will retort to that the original deal, painstakingly negotiated over many years, it was deliberately a narrow deal. They chose to focus on just the nuclear issue because if you throw everything together, and this is a point that was made by the UK foreign minister in the past couple of days, if you try to throw everything into it, you're never going to have a deal. It was deliberately narrow, and in that deliberately narrow range, it was working.
Well, the Iran nuclear deal set a very low bar for compliance. It allowed Iran to continue enriching, and it also didn't do anything to dismantle Iran's nuclear architecture. And what we've discovered is that Iran still has retained the intent to acquire a nuclear weapon. They've been hiding this vast atomic archive in the heart of Tehran, and that was only recently uncovered by the Israelis. And so we don't think that the Iran nuclear deal, by separating the nuclear from terrorism and from all the malign activities, made the region safer. You do need to take a comprehensive approach. You can't bifurcate the nuclear and the security issues.
What would you say to a critic, and I am playing devil's advocate here, that essentially what this proves to a lot of people, the U.S. doesn't want a deal. The objective is not actually to renegotiate and get a new deal. It's to basically break the back of the Iranian regime. It's to perhaps force Iran to restart its nuclear program and give perhaps the United States or Israel, one or the other or both, a pretext for military action against Iran.
That narrative just isn't true. We are seeking a new deal. In fact, Secretary Pompeo said that the United States is ready to enter into a treaty relationship with Iran. And I think the speech yesterday was as much a speech to the Iranian people as it was anything else. And he made clear that the United States is prepared to end all of its sanctions, to restore diplomatic relations, and to welcome Iran into the global economy if it's willing to stop its nuclear program and to stop supporting terrorism across the Middle East. That is the outcome that we're seeking. We're looking for a change in the conduct of the Iranian regime. That's our focus.
And Brian, referring back to what you just said, that appeal sort of to the Iranian people, the words that Mike Pompeo used were basically trying to get the Iranian people to make a choice about their leadership, and he wants them to do it more quickly, as sooner as opposed to later. Now, some people, once again, the devil's advocate argument, read into that. That sounds a lot like regime change. He did not use the words regime change, but it's hard not to listen to those words and say, wait, is the U.S. Secretary of State calling for regime change? Is he?
No, the Secretary of State laid out an entire agenda that involves the Iranian regime changing its conduct. That's the focus. The focus is on the conduct that Iran needs to change. And he laid out 12 areas, and these are all national security objectives that have been endorsed at one time or another by the United States and its European allies. And a lot of those objectives were not achieved during the Iran negotiations, and we plan to put forward a new security architecture that's going to make the region safer and going to then take Iran's nuclear program off the table as a threat.
I quoted at the outset the EU's foreign policy chief, Federica Mogherini, and she's speaking. Obviously, there are dissenting voices in Europe. It doesn't speak as a single bloc all the time. You're aware of that. But in general, the EU has been looking at this move with a mixture, even if they're too polite to say it, of a little bit of horror and confusion, and they're looking at their next move. Do you understand the European position when they say they want to salvage this deal and they think it was a good deal and they want to try to make it work?
Well, you've already seen European companies making their decision to end business with Iran. Total has decided to end business, and so is Siemens. We think that other companies are going to follow suit. We are very focused on achieving our national security objectives, which again, Europe shares most of those same objectives. During the negotiations that we've had with them over the last 3 or 4 months, we have the same threat assessment. We have the same sort of value set. We don't believe that the Iran nuclear deal made the region safer. And we put in place a plan that we think a lot of the world is going to get behind.
But it was working. Do you dispute that it was working? I'm not talking about the archive.
No, it wasn't working.
It wasn't working in the fact that all the international agencies say they were respecting the deal, at least since 2015.
Right. Well, there's 2 things I'd point out in the deal. Iran committed to never seek, develop, or acquire a nuclear weapon. While they were making that promise, they were also retaining the entire atomic archive to restart their nuclear program when all of the restrictions on the program lift under the Iran nuclear deal.
That archive dates back to 2003, though. That archive dates back over a decade, 15 years.
Right, but the Iranian regime protected and preserved and hid from the IAEA 1/2 ton of materials on how to build a nuclear weapon. So they never came clean on their past program on nuclear weapons. The other thing that the Iran deal says is that it will contribute to regional peace and stability. And during the life of the JCPOA, Iran has launched proxy wars across the Middle East and destabilized the entire region. And that is because the JCPOA provided massive sanctions relief that the Iranian regime spent on foreign wars and not on its own people.
What about the Europeans right now? I said at the beginning, so far they're defiant. They want to salvage this deal. Mike Pompeo said he wants to work with the allies. Right now, there's not too much daylight there. I'm just wondering, what happens if the Europeans do defy U.S. sanctions? What if they do say, we think this deal is worth salvaging? What's the next move here? Is the U.S. ready to alienate its longstanding allies in Europe?
I think people are overstating the transatlantic rift. We have, we share the same assessment on threats. We may have a difference on tactics on how to achieve it, but I really do think that over time, we are going to be able to come together with a new diplomatic strategy that's going to be better than what we had in place under the Iran nuclear deal.
Let me pivot briefly with the little time we have left. You know, this is a maximal pressure trying to be put on Iran right now. What about the North Korea talks? The Trump administration says it is planning on the assumption that these talks will go ahead as planned on June 12th in Singapore. That's their operating assumption. Is there an irony here, though, that Donald Trump has been giving some security guarantees to North Korea, while a country like Iran, which has no nuclear weapons, is being given ultimatums?
What we don't want to have happen is diplomacy that on Iran that essentially creates the same sort of outcome we have with North Korea. The United States engaged in 27 years of diplomacy with North Korea, and it's not just the U.S., it's a range of countries that worked in sort of very good faith to try to prevent North Korea's nuclear and missile program, and that strategy did not succeed. We can't apply the same strategy in the context of Iran. And so we are trying to take a very serious and determined approach to ensure that Iran never achieves, that they become a nuclear state. And in the context of North Korea, the president has put on the table a very bright future for the North Korean people if the North Korean regime can end its nuclear and missile program.
I just want to ask you a final question here on neither here nor there, but there have been some criticisms, and Donald Trump says he's aiming to get the cabinet he wants. He has it in place now with his National Security Advisor, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo. He has what has been universally described as a rather hawkish, hardline foreign policy team. Are there any dissenting voices within that circle? Is there anyone who goes to Donald Trump and says, Mr. President, I really think you should reconsider this? Or think twice?
Well, I think the role of the National Security Cabinet is to present the president with a range of options. And since we have a unitary executive under our system of government, the president makes the final decision as commander-in-chief. But his cabinet has done a very good job. Secretary Mattis, Secretary Pompeo, Ambassador Bolton, Secretary Mnuchin at Treasury, putting in place a range of options so that the president makes a very good decision to advance America's national security interests. But are they putting together?
I ask you that not disingenuously. I really mean it in the sense that there was one former retired CIA officer who's referred to Mike Pompeo as a fierce ideologue, a man who, when he was head of the CIA, lacked objectivity, lacked discretion. You probably know who I'm talking about. A man like that, can he ever bring any sort of differing or dissenting voice to the president, which you can argue is part of his job as well?
I think that characterization of Secretary Pompeo is laughable.
Okay, Brian Hook, thank you very much for your time today. From a busy schedule, I imagine, these days. We've been talking about Iran, North Korea, and there's a whole bunch of issues we haven't gotten around to. But once again, thanks. And you've all been watching the interview here on France 24.
Thank you.
Stay tuned.
Thanks.